Matthew chapter 10. This morning we're going to continue our study of the disciples of Jesus, the 12 apostles. And we've been calling this study, All the King's Men. And so I hope it's been a blessing to you. Today we're going to pass the halfway mark, and we are going to look at the 6th and 7th disciple that's mentioned here in Matthew chapter 10. But it is amazing to see as you study the lives of these men, it's amazing to see how God used them to change the world. But before he used them to change the world, he had to change them. And so this morning we're going to look at the 6th and 7th of the disciples. So if you're there in Matthew chapter 10, we're going to look beginning in verse 2. This is one of the records of the disciples in the New Testament. It says in Matthew 10, verse 2, "Now the names of the 12 apostles are these: first Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him." So this morning we're going to look again at, as I mentioned, the 6th and 7th disciple. And the first one we're going to consider this morning is Nathanael. I don't have the clicker this morning, so I'll need you to keep up with me, Heather. But we're going to look at Nathanael. Now, if you were following along with me as I read, and if you're observant, you'll notice that the name Nathanael wasn't in there. You never hear a Nathanael in these verses. And in fact, you don't hear that name in Matthew's list, like we just looked at, in Mark's list, or in Luke's list in his gospel. And he also has another time when he lists the apostles in the book of Acts. You don't see that name. You do see that name, however, in the Gospel of John. And so here he's called Bartholomew in verse 3. Philip, we looked at him last week, and Bartholomew. Now, skeptics and atheists love to jump on this one because, as you know, as you've probably heard, skeptics and atheists say, well, the Bible's just full of contradictions. And so they'll say, this is one of those contradictions. You crazy, stupid, dumb, unintelligent Christians think that this book is accurate, and they will say, well, it's full of contradictions, and this is one of the contradictions that they'll bring up. They couldn't even get the names of the disciples right. They'll say, well, if Matthew and Mark and Luke say that these were disciples, why does John say there was a disciple named Nathanael? Well, I have an easy, simple explanation for you. Bartholomew had another name. It was Nathanael. Okay? That's a very simple explanation. Now, you might say, well, maybe you're just grasping at straws, Pastor Josh. Maybe you're just coming up with answers just because you have blind faith in the Bible. Well, there's some reasons why we believe that Bartholomew and Nathanael are the same guy. They just had, it was just two names for the same person. And as we've seen already, several of the disciples have multiple names. We already looked at Peter. We know him as Peter, but that actually was not his given name when he was born by his parents. They named him Simon. And then Jesus renamed him as Peter. Peter's also called Simon, son of Jonah. So that's three names for one guy. Does that mean that all the gospel writers got it wrong and they had no clue who the disciples were? No, it just means that he had multiple names. There's one disciple that we're going to look at here in the future, and he had three names recorded in Scripture. So it's not unusual for men in this day, even people today, to have multiple names. For instance, if you were to ask, well, what's my name? If you wanted to know what my name was, it would be dependent on who you ask. If you ask one of the kids on my school bus, what's your driver's name? They would say, Mr. Butler. If you ask someone in the church, what's your pastor's name? They would say, Pastor Josh. If you asked one of my friends, what's your friend's name? Oh, his name is Josh. If you asked my mom, what's your son's name? Joshua. Don't call me Joshua. That's only something that my mom calls me when I get in trouble. Does that mean I have, are we talking about different people here? No, it means that I'm one person, but I have different names. In the same way, this man named Bartholomew also went by Nathanael. Now, it's interesting to think about this name Bartholomew before we consider Nathanael. The name Bartholomew is actually a Hebrew surname. So that's another reason why we understand that Nathanael had multiple names. In Hebrew, if you put bar before a name, that means son of. For instance, in the United States, some people's surname is Johnson. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you trace it back in their family tree, at some point, someone was named Johnson because his dad's name was John. That's John's son. Or Thompson. Who's Thompson? That's Tom's son. In Hebrew, you would put bar before a name to indicate the son of. So the name Bartholomew actually means the son of, in Hebrew, Tolmai. The son of Tolmai. For instance, we talked about this already. Peter was named Peter or Simon Bar Jonah. What does that mean? Simon, son of Jonah. So again, it's not a stretch for us to say Bartholomew and Nathanael are the same guy. So don't allow skeptics and atheists to cause doubt, to lie to you. The Bible isn't full of contradictions. Anytime you see something that might seem like a contradiction, there is always a simple explanation, just like what we went through just now. So let's think about this man named Bartholomew or Nathanael. Let's look at what the Bible has to say. So I'm going to have you turn to John chapter 1, because that's where we get the most information about this man named Nathanael. Matthew mentions him, Mark and Luke, but all three of them only really mention him by name. John gives us much more information, and we're going to look at his call into the ministry. In John chapter 1, this is really the most information we have in these verses. It says in John chapter 1, beginning in verse 43, this: The following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said to him, "Come and see." So in this section, we've already looked at this section of John. Earlier, we saw the call of Peter and we saw the call of Andrew. And depending on who you read, there is debate about the other unnamed disciple whom Jesus told or asked to follow him. I believe it's the Apostle John. He, as he does throughout his gospel, he neglects to mention his name. He loves to do that. And so I think the Apostle John was called here in this section. If you read verses 35 through 42, which we already did earlier, you'll see their call. But now, Jesus calls Philip, and then Philip runs and goes and finds Nathanael. And from the interaction that Philip and Nathanael have, we learn something about this man named Nathanael. The first thing I want to share with you today is that Nathanael was, number one, a prophecy man. He was a prophecy man. Philip had been introduced to Jesus. He got to know him, and he was excited. And so the first thing that he does, just like Andrew did with his brother, Philip goes and finds his friend Nathanael and says, "Hey, we found the Messiah." And as he speaks to him, notice what he says in verse 45. As he has this interaction, he says, "We've found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote." And just from that little sentence, we see that Nathanael and his friend Philip were into prophecy. They were interested in God's word. The Old Testament, according to the Jews, was structured differently than our Old Testament. They studied and read the exact same books that we study and read, but they structured them in a different way. Okay? So if you look at an Old Testament from a Jewish Bible. They have the exact same books, they just structure them differently. Okay? They, as it says in verse number 45, they believed in Moses and the prophets. So the way that we structure our Old Testament is that we don't structure it chronologically by time, we structure it by type, genre. Okay, so the first 17 books of the Old Testament are history, and then there is poetry, and then there is prophecy. They kind of flipped it around. They had the books of Moses. The first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses. And then they had the prophets. Some of that was history, but some of that was the prophets, like Isaiah and Jeremiah. And then after that, they had the poetry, or what they called the writings. And so what we learn from this is that both Philip and Nathanael were studying their scriptures. They were studying the Old Testament. They wanted to know, what did Moses say about the Messiah? What did the prophets have to say about this chosen one who would come, this king of Israel who was going to come? And that's something that was going on in this time period. Remember when we studied the book of Daniel, Daniel was very specific about when the Messiah would come. And there is some theory, there are some theories out there about who the wise men were who came to welcome the Messiah into the world. Some believe they were disciples of Daniel, who, again, was in Babylon. He was an exile in Babylon. And he wrote his prophecies in Babylon, and there he had students, and they studied his writings, and they figured out when the Messiah would come. And so it wasn't just people in Israel who were excited about the Messiah coming. It was people even all the way over in Babylon, or at that time, what would be known as Persia. And so Nathanael and his friend Philip were thinking about the scriptures, thinking about the Old Testament prophecies. There are so many, and I don't have time to get into them now, but you can read them in the book of Genesis. Moses lists one there. There's one later on in his writings. They're all over the prophets. Isaiah was full of prophecies about this Messiah. And Philip and Nathanael are excited about this, and then all of a sudden, Nathanael meets Jesus, and he runs to his friend. Philip meets Jesus. He runs to his friend Nathanael, and he says, "We found him. We've been searching for him, and we finally discovered him." Now, when someone is selling you on something, when you have a friend or a relative and they're trying to convince you of something, you need to study what is it that they use to try to convince you. What is it that Philip used to try to convince Nathanael? It was the Old Testament scriptures. It was the prophecy that they had been studying. So that's the first thing that we can learn from him. He was a man of prophecy. And we can learn from that in that we too need to be studying our scriptures. We looked at that a little bit last week, but it's important to harp on that every time. The Bible tells us that we should meditate on God's law. And we should not just meditate on it every once in a while, but day and night. And that's something that Nathanael, the disciple, did. But as we see his reaction in verse 46, we learn something else about Nathanael. Not only was he a prophecy man, he was, number 2, he was a prejudiced man. Notice what he says in verse 46. And Nathanael said to Philip, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" So Philip said to him, "Well, come and see." Later on in this gospel, we do find just one other mention of Nathanael. And in passing, John says, Nathanael was from Cana. So all the disciples that we've looked at so far, I believe, are from Galilee, the northern region of Israel. Andrew and Philip and James and John, Andrew, Simon, Andrew, Peter, James, and John were all from the same area, as well as Philip. But Nathanael was from a town a little farther away from Andrew, Peter, James, and John's town. It was called Cana. You've probably heard of Cana before because that's where Jesus performed his first miracle. And that's described in chapter 2 of the Gospel of John, where he turned water into wine at the wedding of Cana. Well, if you look on a map, you can look on it in the back of your Bible if you want to. Some Bibles have that. If you look on a map for Cana, you'll find that Nazareth was really close to Cana. And apparently there was some rivalry between these two towns, Cana and Nazareth. They were very close. Cana was a little farther off the beaten path. Nazareth was a little far off the beaten path, but not as far as Cana. And there appears to have been some prejudices in Nathanael's heart and his mind against people from Nazareth. One of the commentaries I read said that the common opinion was that Nazareth was full of ignorant and evil people. Jesus didn't come from the places in Israel or the places in the Roman Empire that had prestige. He came from the outskirts. He came from a little tiny town that really didn't mean anything. I think I've mentioned this before, when I was in college, there was a town north of us. We were in Greenville, South Carolina, which now is actually a pretty decent town. I've noticed on some articles that a lot of people are moving to Greenville. It was nice back then, but it's even nicer now. But north of our town, Greenville, there was a town called Pumpkin Town. Pumpkin Town was nothing. It just had one little flashing light. It didn't even have a store, just a couple of old stores that had been run down and were closed down. And everyone kind of made fun of Pumpkin Town because it was nothing. It'd be like someone saying, the Messiah is from Pumpkin Town. Or the Messiah is from Cleveland, Ohio. What? Nothing good can come from Cleveland, Ohio. That's kind of Nathanael's heart. He was prejudiced. He had judged, and that's what the word prejudice means. He had prejudged. And so what does his friend Philip have to say? All he says is, hey, come and see. I really like that strategy of Philip's. And sometimes, I'm not saying every single time you should use this, but sometimes that's what you can do with your friends who are skeptical about Jesus. Hey, let's open up God's Word together. Let's see Him. Come and see who He is. And let Him speak for Himself. It's important for us to learn the lesson that Nathanael did learn eventually, and that is that we shouldn't be prejudiced. Don't judge a book by its cover. Because Nathanael was prejudiced, he almost missed out on meeting the Messiah himself. But thankfully, he listened to his friend Philip, and he did go and he did meet Jesus. And we learn of that in verse 47. It says in John 1:47, Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, and he said of him, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? And Jesus answered and said to him, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Nathanael answered and said to him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. Jesus answered and said to him, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And he said to him, most assuredly I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. What we see lastly about Nathanael, not only was he a prophecy man and he was a prejudiced man, he became a persuaded man. Number 3. Nathanael was a persuaded man. The persuasion, the thing that persuaded him of Jesus' true identity was the fact that Jesus said, I saw you when you were under the fig tree. And apparently this is a miracle. What goes on here is Jesus is claiming or Jesus is displaying the fact that he is all-knowing. Nobody was around Nathanael when he was sitting under the fig tree. He was sitting there thinking, and all of a sudden Philip comes up to him. And Jesus tells him about what he was doing when nobody else could have known, when especially Jesus couldn't have known because he wasn't around. And this one action proved beyond the shadow of a doubt to this man Nathanael that Jesus is the Messiah. This man who my friend Philip believes in, I believe in him too. It's amazing to me how quickly this man was persuaded. Notice what he says about him. He says in verse 49, Rabbi, number 1, you are the Son of God, number 2, and number 3, you are the King of Israel. What is rabbi? Rabbi means teacher. So immediately, this man Nathanael believed in Jesus as his teacher. And immediately he believed in him as the Son of God. And immediately he believed in him as the King, the Messiah, the one who would come, who was promised, the Son of David, who would sit on David's throne and reign in Israel. It's amazing to me to see how quickly this man Nathanael was persuaded. Later on, again, in the Gospel of John, he's only mentioned very quickly by name, and then in the book of Acts, he's mentioned by name. But that's really all we have about this man named Nathanael. In church history, or church tradition tells us that Nathanael died by martyrdom. He was willing to spend the rest of his life after this moment following this man Jesus, believing in this man Jesus, and preaching of this man Jesus. And he went to the death believing and trusting in him. Well, there's another man we're going to look at this morning, another disciple. His name is Thomas. And just like Nathanael, he was a man who was a doubter. He was a man who was skeptical about Jesus. And to learn about him, we need to turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 20. So flip through with me to John chapter 20. And many of us are familiar with Thomas. We know him as what? Doubting Thomas, right? Poor guy. Makes one mistake, and then for the rest of his life, he's known as Doubting Thomas. I was listening to a comedian recently, and this comedian was of the boomer generation, and he talked about his childhood growing up and how in his class there were two guys who had unique nicknames. One of his classmates was named Niner, and the other one was named Aimer. They named the boy Niner because he only had 9 fingers. He had an accident and lost a finger, so they called him Niner. And then the other kid, his name was Aimer because he lost an eye and always looked like he was aiming a gun, so they called him Aimer. Anyway, it was a funny story. But poor Doubting Thomas, he's forever known with this negative name as a doubter. But we read about the story of his doubt here in John chapter 20, beginning in verse 24. It says, Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So let me just kind of set the scene here a little bit. This is the end of the Gospel of John. Jesus has already been arrested. He's already been crucified. He's already been buried. He rose again. And Jesus has appeared to the other disciples, but not to Thomas. He wasn't there that day when Jesus appeared to them. And so that's why it says in verse 24, Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came or appeared to them. Then in verse 25, Thomas, it says, The other disciples therefore said to him, We have seen the Lord. So he said to them, Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. So just like Nathanael, Thomas, number 1, was skeptical. This is a miracle. People don't just rise from the dead, especially when you see someone be crucified on a Roman cross. So it's important for us to think about this. Why was Thomas so skeptical? On the one hand, Thomas had been following Jesus for years. He was there from the beginning. He had seen all of Jesus' miracles. And in the Gospel of John, again, John explains or describes 7 different miracles that Jesus performed. Thomas had seen all of them. He heard Jesus even say, I'm going to be crucified, I'm going to be arrested, and then I'm going to rise again. He heard that. And yet, he didn't believe. Now, on the other hand, Thomas knew that Jesus was dead. He saw him die. Thomas knew that Roman soldiers don't just let people survive crucifixion. If someone is supposed to be executed in the Roman government and a Roman soldier is supposed to carry out that execution, if he fails to do his job, guess what? That soldier is supposed to be executed. And so they had a lot of motivation to do the job right. And the descriptions that we have in the Gospels, there's no other explanation of what happened to Jesus other than the fact that he died. He was dead. He was buried. And now his friends are saying Jesus came back to life? People don't just come back to life. And so Thomas says, I'm not going to believe. You guys are crazy. Something's wrong with all of you people. You've gone mad. You're all hallucinating. And so Thomas demands something that a lot of people in our day and age want to demand, and that is scientific proof. He wants to observe what's going on. He wants to use his senses to test their theory. And he says, I want to actually put my fingers in the nail prints. I want to know this is actually Jesus who was nailed to the cross. I want to put my hand in his side and know that was the man that was stabbed in the side by the Roman guard. You people are crazy, he thinks. Now, when it comes to proving something historical, I just want to tell you this. A lot of people will say, I don't believe in religion, or I don't believe in the Bible, because you can't prove it to me scientifically. Hey, let's think about that. That, first of all, is not a scientific claim. That's called a philosophical claim. Okay? You can't prove that claim scientifically either. Okay, but the other point is this. You can't prove history scientifically. If something happened in the past, how do you prove it happened? How do we know George Washington was our first president? You can't prove it scientifically. It's not observable or repeatable, right? History can't be repeated. But we can find evidence that proves that George Washington was our first president. In the same way, we can find evidence that Jesus was a real man, that he was crucified, that he did rise again. And we'll look a little bit at his resurrection here in a moment. Thomas was, number one, skeptical. But as we read along here, we see that Thomas became radical. Look at verse 26 with me. It says, and after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace to you. Then he said to Thomas, reach your finger here and look at my hands. And reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. I mentioned this last week, and I'm going to mention it again now. A lot of people say that John, the apostle, in his book, he describes 7 miracles of Jesus. I believe there's 8, and I think this is the 8th. The resurrection of Jesus is the culmination of all of his signs, of all of his miracles. And it proved to his disciples that he really was who he claimed to be. It proved to the most skeptical disciple, Thomas, that Jesus was, look at what he says in verse number 28. Jesus was his Lord and his God. To a Jewish man, that was blasphemy. That was something deserving of death. But Jesus proved it beyond the shadow of a doubt. He was who he claimed to be. He was Lord. He was his master. And not just his master, he was, notice what he says, he was God. God himself. Only God could do something like this. As we read through the rest of the New Testament, we really don't see much more about this man named Thomas, just like we don't see much more about Nathanael. But we do know from church tradition that he went on to preach about Jesus Christ and to share with others about who he was. Church tradition tells us that he went to India and he began to spread Christianity and the gospel into the country of India. And then church tradition also tells us that he ended up being martyred just like his friend Philip, just like his other friends. He was ran through with a spear, according to church tradition. But I want us to think about this. A man who was skeptical became radical. Someone who was willing to die for his faith. Because that's the reality of the disciples. Some skeptics and some atheists will say, well, the disciples just did what they did to gain power and to gain money. But if you've studied it out, you know that the disciples had nothing at all to gain from telling others that Jesus rose again from the dead. What did they have to gain? Well, beatings, stonings, persecution, torture, and ultimately death. But these men were willing to literally go to the death, to torturous death, to tormenting death, in saying that yes, Jesus is God, and Jesus was crucified, he was buried, and he rose again. And for me, that is something that convinces me of the reality of Jesus. That's something that builds confidence in my faith and trust in Jesus Christ. As we close, I want to quote to you something from Chuck Colson. Those of you who know any or were around during President Nixon's presidency maybe have heard that name. Chuck Colson worked with the president, and he was involved in the big scandal in Nixon's presidency called Watergate. And Chuck Colson ended up going to prison for some time because of his involvement in the scandal of Watergate. He says this: Watergate involved a conspiracy to cover up perpetuated by the closest aides to the President of the United States, the most powerful men in America, who were intensely loyal to their president. But one of them, John Dean, turned state's evidence, that is, he testified against Nixon, as he put it, to save his own skin. And he did so only 2 weeks after informing the president about what was really going on. 2 weeks. The real cover-up, the lie, could only be held together for 2 weeks. And then everybody else jumped ship in order to save themselves. Now the fact is that all that those around the president were facing was embarrassment and maybe some short prison time. Nobody's life was at stake. But what about the disciples? 12 powerless men, peasants really, were facing not just embarrassment or political disgrace, but beatings, stonings, and execution. Every single one of the disciples insisted to their dying breaths that they had physically seen Jesus' body raised from the dead. Don't you think that one of those apostles would have cracked before being beheaded or stoned? That one of them would have made a deal with the authorities? None did. That, for me, speaks volumes. So this morning, I don't know if you're a doubter like Nathanael or like Thomas, but if you are, you can have confidence that Jesus is who he claimed to be, because doubters and skeptics in his day, his own followers, were convinced and were willing to go to the death, claiming that he was Jesus, the Messiah, who was raised again from the dead. So as we think about these men who were doubters and skeptics, it really bolsters our faith. And I want to encourage you this morning that if you doubt, there is no reason to doubt. We have evidence to back up the claims of Jesus. He really is our Lord and our God. He really is our rabbi. He really is the King of Israel. So this morning, I hope you will leave encouraged and with your heart uplifted, knowing Jesus is the